Welcome to Aging Rewired, a podcast by Senior Planet from AARP, where we explore the intersections of aging and technology. I'm your host, Sheila Solomon. In today's episode of Aging Rewired, we say the B word a lot, so you may want to wait until your grandkids are not in the room to listen. Now enjoy the show. Here at Aging Rewired, we like to think of our podcast as boundary pushing, but we're well aware we're not the first or only game in town. Other older adult podcasters, like my two guests today, have been hitting the airwaves for years with thought-provoking conversations about aging.
I did not imagine that the time in my life when I would feel most myself and that I would feel the greatest freedom would be in my 60s, 70s, hopefully 80s and 90s, to go. That was a surprise.
Joining me today are Joanne Sandler and Idelisse Malavé, host of the podcast, Two Old Bitches. Their podcast shares the stories of women 50 and older whose perspectives and experiences disrupt what it means to be old and reclaim what it means to be a bitch. And preparing for this interview, I've already said the B word enough times to make up for the prior dearth of its exit from my 72-year-old mouth. About that word, bitches, what would your grandmothers or mothers say about the title of your podcast?
Actually, bitches is an acronym, and the acronym stands for being in total charge of herself. And my mother, regardless of that explanation, would not be happy.
It's funny you say that, Sheila, because I think we have been fascinated by the spectrum of reactions we've gotten to that title, ranging from, people, and particularly I think younger women, but not just younger women, who love it. They can't say it enough. They love calling us old bitches. So there's a lot of joy in using that word for some people. There is, I think, a lot of discomfort. I have friends who say, I'd like to tell people about your podcast, but I really can't say the name. Or I'd like to be on your podcast, but I would never be able to promote it to anybody because I can't say the name. And Idelisse and I and our guests at different times have talked about, can you reclaim that word? Because it has been used against women to demean women and still is in different circumstances. So it's a big question for us. Also, from a social media perspective, it's very hard for us to promote our work on social media because it rejects it on the basis of profanity.
I find that it's more useful than not. I like sharing the name when I'm talking to a group with individuals. And I feel the minute I say two old bitches, the young people in the room, not just the young women, but all the young people in the room, kind of their shoulders go down, they relax a little bit, they start laughing, and they speak to me not as the little white-haired old lady, sitting next to them, but to the woman who just said bitch.
Yeah. What about you, Sheila? How do you react to the word?
You heard me respond to that.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. But yesterday, I happened to be having a meeting with a 20-something, and I told her what I was working on, and I told her the name of the show. Well, she had just the reaction you two are talking about. She smiled. I mean, she really lit up. She laughed, and she said, "Oh, wow, that sounds like fun. I'm checking that out."
We have T-shirts, and I wear my T-shirt when I run or walk around Central Park. And in my neighborhood on 110th Street and 5th Avenue, as I go by, I get high fives, I get laughter. I go, "You go, sister." And it's a delight.
One of your podcasts, I heard you say Diana Nyad, turned off by the name, refused to come on your show.
Yeah.
That's true.
Have others said no just because of the title?
Yes.
Who else?
People that I've asked have
Oh,
said,
okay.
no, I can't.
No one's ever said no to me. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, not not the majority, certainly, but there are certainly people who have said it makes them uncomfortable.
I think what's much more common is that they'll come on the podcast, and in the beginning, we would usually ask more than we do now. So what do you think of the title, or et cetera? And they'll share with us how uncomfortable it makes them, or how inappropriate they think it is, that they think we shouldn't use it. We had one friend recently who will go nameless, who we've taped with and done interviews with, and who said to us the other day, we had no idea, I feel so uncomfortable. I don't want to say that I'm working with you guys on something called Two Old Bitches. And I was like, really? So, yeah.
Even Sheila, even the act of asking someone their age on the show, we got pushback. We had one guest, an amazing guest.
Oh, one of my favorites.
And when we asked her age, she's a performer, and she said, she wasn't going to really talk about being on a show called Old Bitches, Two Old Bitches, not because of the bitches, because of the old. And the old is actually much more transgressive for some women than the bitch part. And she said, my agent would kill me if I was publicizing that I was on a podcast that had old in the title and shared my age.
Heaven forbid a woman should be old.
I also just finished reading a book where the author writes, "Words matter, and I want to be clear in my language. I am refusing to give up words that are important to me because others demean them or misuse them or label them as jargon. Instead, I'm reclaiming them here." And so this author, Sally Z. Hare, has placed those words in a glossary in the back of her book, The Elder Garten, a field guide for the journey of a lifetime.
Wow. Beautiful.
Great title, too.
Beautiful.
What about older adults who are looking for some project, something they think will fulfill them, give them purpose? What advice might you offer them?
I'm not in the business of giving advice, to tell you the truth.
You're not?
I'm not. I do it, but I'm not in the business of giving advice. But the fact is, I think for me, the place I've come to, I'm 77. We've been doing this since I was in my late 60s, 68 or something. And what I have, with some surprise, appreciated about this time in my life is that because I have not a lot, but enough resources where I don't have to, though I do work, I could manage without, but I have enough resources and more than many people do, that I can please myself. And in pleasing myself, it allowed me to think about what are those things that I knew I always wanted to do and never, I was working, I was a single mom, I had 2 children, I didn't have a lot of time, and I love art. And I didn't get to paint and make art. But when I got into my 60s, I started taking painting classes, and now ask me what I am. I'm an artist. I do work with clay now. It's discovering something that was there. For other people, I think it's just following their curiosity. And for other people, I think particularly for creative people, it's why would I stop doing what I do, right? If I'm an artist, I think the New York Times has a series called The Unstoppables. And I was reading an interview with an 82-year-old director, and he says, why would I stop doing this? So I think it's looking to yourself, and I think sometimes the hardest thing a woman, given the way we've been socialized, can do is to figure out what she wants, what her desires are, what her real dreams are, what's meaningful to her. And then she can follow it.
I also think that I was listening, Sheila, to the episode you did on rewriting the script on aging, on the class in filmmaking for older people, which I thought was fascinating. And it made me think about how important it is, if you can, to challenge yourself, to allow yourself to be uncomfortable, to allow yourself to be a learner, in your 60s and 70s and 80s, when there's so much rhetoric around, the wisdom of being our age and all your life experience, and to throw that off and say, no, I am still a learner. I am still someone who discovers. I am still someone who makes mistakes and learns from mistakes, because my life isn't over. It's actually in progress. And so, yeah, I think that part also is
I
important.
think realizing that and I know many people think about their legacy a lot. It's not something I think about a lot, but I know others do. But I think the importance of, even if you're thinking about that, embracing that your past does not define you, right? That you are, as Joanne said, you're still becoming. You're still becoming. And you stop becoming when you die. And given, that I don't have that many years left, I really would like to live in the years that I have.
Now we're going to take a quick break to tell you that Aging Rewired is a podcast produced by Senior Planet from AARP. If you're interested in exploring all that Senior Planet from AARP has to offer, you can find us online at www.seniorplanet.org. The Senior Planet website offers a variety of free virtual programs each week, from technology lectures to exercise sessions, discussion groups, and special events. Can't make it to a live class? On-demand programs and tech tip videos let you learn on your own schedule. On seniorplanet.org, you can also find original and engaging articles for older adult readers on topics like finance, health, entertainment, and relationships. Looking to meet new friends with common interests? Explore Senior Planet Community, our ad-free social platform exclusive to older adults. This safe digital space is a place for you to join interest groups, start conversations, and make connections. Still have questions about Senior Planet? Call our free hotline at 888-713-3495, Monday through Friday between 9 a.m. and 8 p.m. Eastern. Find out about upcoming programs and receive free tech help from our team of patient, helpful agents. Learn how to use Zoom, set up an email account, and more. That hotline number is 888-713-3495. Now let's get back to the episode. When it comes to gender and age, who's listening to the show, and what are they saying about why they listen?
Well, that is a really good question. And I think as a podcaster yourself, you know that it is really hard to know who's listening to the show, because you see, there are 10,000 downloads or 40,000 downloads or 60,000 downloads, and you can get a sense of location and time of day, but it is hard to know who's listening. I think we get a lot of feedback from a very diverse listenership, from younger women who give us feedback that it makes them happy and hopeful, and they get a real kick out of it, and they remember particular episodes and particular lines, to women our age who just love the stories. They love hearing the stories.
The reality is that the majority of podcast listeners are not people our age, right? They're younger people. And the early data that we got was that it was primarily women in their 30s into their 40s. And the women we talked to that age said what Joanne just mentioned. It's like when a woman hits her 30s, 40s, where all of a sudden she's getting the sense that she's going to, her expiration date as a woman in the world is almost up. Listening to two older women and the guests that we bring who sound alive, like they're having a good time, like they are still curious and doing all sorts of things out in the world, still making their way, still creative. They just find that so heartening. It's in person. They grin at you as they, tell you this. And I think in this world where that's still the message, that aging is such a loss, even at that age, right? Aging is a loss. To get a message of no, it can be a time of greater freedom, in fact.
And I think also, Sheila, one of the stereotypes I think about aging that you hear a lot and you hear people say a lot is, and particularly for women, although I think men also experience it, is this question of invisibility, right? That as you get older, you kind of cease to appear publicly, whether you're in restaurants or in public transport, people don't pay attention to you. You try to get people's attention. And I think Idelisse and I don't experience that so much. We don't, or at least we don't notice it if it's happening. And so I think that was another engine for choosing the word bitch. It's feisty, it's in your face, it's not ignorable. And so that was, it just, boom, we said it and it made sense.
But now you've also interviewed men on occasion. Are you hearing from men?
We do hear from men.
Yeah,
and what are they saying?
Well, first of all, I do think that it's harder for men to say bitch. Some men, right? I think that there is a hesitation. Can I call you bitch?
And I'd rather they not, actually. It's sort of like we can say bitch. Women can say bitch. They cannot.
Right. There's a kind of self-selection in the kind of men who we would interview and the kind of men who would listen. So we have interviewed men who self-identify as bitch, and also men who are interested in the topic of aging, of what happens as you get older, and who are writing about it or tweeting about it.
And we should clarify that we have only interviewed two men.
Two men.
Out of what? Yeah, it's
two
Stephen and
90.
Out of, what are we,
About
90, 100 people that we've interviewed. So they're definitely in the minority.
So what are some of the stereotypes or ageist narratives that you're having conversations about with your listeners?
It's so funny that you asked that question, because one of the interviews we decided to interview ChatGPT.
And this was months ago, right? When ChatGPT was first available to the masses.
Right. And we asked Chat to be an older woman from the South.
Chat started answering, and it's all, typed in answers. So there's no voice. But it was this very formal academic voice. So after we were at it for a little while, I typed in, is there any way that you could sound like an older woman, like a friend, a peer, just a regular person? And the next words out of her fingers, I guess, on the keyboard were, sure, honey. And she talked to us that way.
And we asked her your question. We asked her, what are the negative stereotypes? What are the slurs? What are the things that people say or think? And it was so interesting that Chat didn't want to talk about those things. Chat actually was they're very politically correct. They basically said, we have to be very careful about stereotyping or articulating slurs about any group, including older people. So I think it was just, when you asked that question, I thought it's so interesting that we shy away from talking about the negative stereotypes.
And it does make you wonder about who's programming ChatGPT.
Yes.
So let's go back just slightly, time-wise. How long have you two known each other?
A very long time.
I would say since 1991.
1991. I was working at the Ms. Foundation, and Joanne was consulting with us. And we got to know each other, and then we ended up leading a delegation to the Women's World
The
Conference.
Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing.
And we had a delegation of over 100 women, activists and donors. And
two men.
I think I don't know what I would have done without Joanne on that delegation, because it was not an easy thing to do. And we just resonated with each other, I think, very strongly. She was always helpful to me as a consultant, but she was just fun to be with. And then I moved out to the West Coast for 14 years. And when I came back, we hadn't stayed in touch very well. But I came back. I was like, I let her know, oh, I'm back in New York. And a few weeks later, she says, you're still working as a consultant? I want to talk to you about a job. I was consulting at that time. And she sent me to Afghanistan, for which my children will never forgive her.
Idelisse, were you a lawyer?
I was a public interest lawyer. I worked at the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund. And then I did family law and small business law, but only for women and people of color, as we called it back then. And then I started working at the Ms. Foundation and did other foundation work and then organizational consulting.
So you might have written a book, but you chose to start a podcast.
You've heard our story. We considered a book. And we've both written books, and we both decided that we really didn't want to do that part of it, sit in the room and write. And actually, as Ide said, when we met in the 90s, I think one of the things that I loved about Idelisse and we loved to do together was ask questions. We were always, interviewing each other or anybody else who would put up with us. And so after we considered doing a book, we said to each other, really, what do we like doing more than anything? Asking questions and, feeding our curiosity. And so we didn't know what a podcast was, actually. We had no idea. I had just been in Brighton in the UK, and I met this young woman who was doing a podcast, but I didn't really know what a podcast was. And when Idelisse and I said to each other, doing a book sounds kind of boring. I was like, what about a podcast? Right, and too much work, right? What about a podcast? And then serendipitously, the very next day, we got an email at this co-working space about someone who was helping people do podcasts. And we reached out to her, and she became our production person for many years. So it was very
she helped
serendipitous.
Get us started and supported us for a very long time.
I know that making a podcast isn't easy. How long have you two been doing this podcast?
I think 8 years. We're going on 8 years.
Yeah, we're going on our 10th season.
What makes all of the work that goes into this worth it?
I have so much fun doing it. I love working with Joanne. I love thinking with Joanne. I love collaborating with her. And I also, as Joanne mentioned, I love questions. I'm so curious, and I love a conversation, and we get to have these on the episodes that we do. I love a conversation where if you really follow the conversation well, you can ask a really good question, follow-up question that maybe the interviewee hasn't really thought about, and allows them to realize that they know something or to think of something that they hadn't before. And in the beginning, we did it mostly in person, and you just see them light up, as they realize something, as they benefit from the exchange that this kind of podcast can be.
It's such a joy to listen to the stories, to listen to, as Ide said, the revelations. We once went to interview this woman, one of our interviewees, I won't name her right now. And when we walked in, she said, I don't know why you're interviewing me, because I listen to your podcasts, and your stories on your podcast are happy stories with happy endings and people who are living life and loving life. And she said, my story is a very sad one. I don't have a happy ending. And so I'm not sure you want to interview me. And we said, okay, well, let's just go through the conversation and see where we come out. And at the end, as we were saying to her, we were still interviewing her. So as you reflect back on your life, what kind of reflection do you have? And she said, actually, I had a great life, a really good life. And so just in the process of the conversation, she kind of changed the way she saw her life. We have another friend who called after she listened to her episode and said, I was so surprised. I could be friends with that person. I really like that person. There is a very personal thing that happens in the process.
I also just want to add this. I have worked as a lawyer. I have run organizations. I work as a consultant. And in my work life, every time I spoke, I had to think about the impact of my words vis-a-vis the organization I was representing or running or whatever, right? I didn't have that full freedom of expression. And on this podcast, I can say whatever I am thinking and want to say.
Yeah, that's true.
Your show, the one I host, and many others similar to what we're doing, are not only pushing back in some ways against stereotypes of older adults, but also introducing older adults to opportunities they may not have considered. In your interview with Golden Bachelor contestant Kathy Schwartz,
Yeah, Schwartz, yes.
she talks about her experience and the risk the franchise took, as she called it, showing older adults looking for love. But she also says it was a hit and says there'll be more. So my question for you is, what have you learned from this podcast you're doing about getting older that surprised you?
I guess one thing that surprised me is how meaty, how juicy, how much content there is in the subject of getting older and how many different directions you can take it in. To be honest, I didn't really think about it that much. It just happens, right? Whether you like it or not, it's happening. Again, going back to that episode you did on film, one of the things that Idelisse and I started doing about 2 or 3 years ago were episodes called Screen Bitches, which was about looking at representation of older women in media. It's putting on kind of a different set of glasses. We are, I think, both of us great consumers of media.
Yes.
I was never looking through that lens before. And once we started looking through that lens and seeing, how rarely older women had meaningful roles. More now, of course, but still very hard, especially women of color, very few older women. And then what actually constitutes a positive, powerful role for older women in media. And it's been really interesting thinking about that and watching media in a completely different way once you put those glasses on.
I always go back to, I did not imagine that the time in my life when I would feel most myself and that I would feel the greatest freedom would be in my 60s, 70s, hopefully 80s and 90s, to go. That was a surprise that I have these full days, whether I still do a little bit of consulting or whether it's one of my studio days or whether I'm going to work with Joanne, that I have this variety of things I love to do with some measure of ease. I get to choose. I want to do this today. I don't want to do this today. That level of choice is a surprise to me, and that it's not about filling an emptiness. I would hear these stories about, you get old and then you sit in your house lonely and dejected with nothing to do and nobody visits mom, and not my experience. It's been a surprise for me.
And we've also, I have to say, been very lucky in terms of timing that when we started Two Old Bitches, there was very little out there about aging and older women or older people. It's kind of exploded, not surprisingly, probably as baby boomers. And when COVID hit, it was amazing how easy it was to transition to Zoom. I don't know what would have happened if we didn't have Zoom. And I know we're all tired of Zoom, but I have to say I give thanks to Zoom every day, because what it allowed us to continue to do was pure joy in a context that was not pure joy.
We kept doing our interviews and we expanded. In the beginning, we focused so much on in-person that it was mostly other women in New York or who were visiting New York. But, COVID opened up the world to us. Yes, Argentina, absolutely. Brazil. Yeah. We've been to many new places. Right.
So this really is the last question. Unless you say something that prompts me to ask one more. On the technology end, what was your experience as you started out doing podcasts? Were you comfortable being behind a mic and being on the screen? And
of course, the sound of your own voice when you're not accustomed to listening to the sound of your own voice is like a horror movie. It's so hard to even get yourself to get your ear to listen. And I think Idelisse and I got over that pretty quickly. I also felt from the very beginning that I had a kind of DIY approach at the beginning that, we needed to do the interviews, edit the interviews, load the podcast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we hired someone, but I thought, temporarily, we're going to learn all those things. And we have friends who do that with their podcasts. They do soup to nuts. I became very comfortable, and I think Ide too, we don't have to do everything. We can do the part we love.
We can do the interview, right, and ask the questions we love. We can review the transcript and direct the editing, but I don't want to sit and actually physically edit, do the digital editing of what we recorded. I don't feel any desire to do that. I think both of us are relatively comfortable with computers generally. It was the nature of our work. So that, working on a computer, doing this having to learn things, you just do it. It's part of what you do. And was never really intimidated by technology. I also was very fortunate to have an eldest child who was technologically oriented. So if I ever confronted a problem I couldn't solve myself, all I had to do was get on the phone and then share my screen with him, and he would take care of it.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. It's such a pleasure to meet you.
And it was a great conversation, Sheila. It was great talking with you.
I'm going to continue listening to you.
Oh, and we're going to listen to you.
Our next episode is about shopping.
Shopping? Oh, okay. I know a little bit about that.
We should. Can I say it?
What?
No.
What? Say it.
We want to interview you for Two Old Bitches.
Oh.
Think about it. You don't have to respond, but we would love to interview you for our show.
I am flattered to even be asked, and we will get back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Aging Rewired, a new podcast by Senior Planet from AARP. We end every episode by sharing what aging with attitude means to our listeners. Here's what Gwendolyn had to say. Aging with attitude is understanding what you want out of your life today and right now and going after it. I want to be intentional about what I say and do, keeping my goals in mind, understanding the purpose behind the goals that I set for myself. Well, Gwendolyn, that's good counsel for all of our listeners. If you want to share what aging with attitude means to you, head over to seniorplanet.org/podcast, where you can send us an audio note. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Aging Rewired. Until next time, I'm Sheila Solomon. Let's keep aging with attitude.